Spanish treasure fleets. From the 16th to 18th centuries, two treasure fleets sailed each year, one to Mexico and the other to Central America, then part of the Spanish Empire. There they collected precious Eastern goods and the riches of the Americas, including tons of silver from mines in Peru and Mexico. Known as the plate fleets, from Plata, silver, the two convoys grouped at Havana, Cuba, before sailing back to Spain. The Spanish galleons that carried this treasure and which protected other, similar vessels in the convoy were well armed with cannons and packed with troops. Privateers, buccaneers, and pirates were sorely tempted by these floating treasure houses that carried in their holds more than the annual revenue of some European kingdoms. The convoy system, though, worked well, and with most enemies targeting the treasure ports instead, the greatest risk for the treasure fleets was to be wrecked by storms, treacherous currents, or hidden coral reefs. From Spain to the Americas. From the first half of the 16th century, Spain was in control of much of Central and South America. From conquered peoples like the Aztecs, Maya, and Incas, the Spanish extracted whatever objects of value they could find, and they exploited silver mines in Mexico and Peru. The treasure fleets were the ships that brought this wealth back to Europe, riches which now belonged to the Spanish crown, the colonial merchants who sent it to their partners in Europe, or the private investors of the fleets. Each year from 1543, two different fleets of Spanish galleons and other ships sailed from Spain to the Americas. They were loaded up with coinage, bullion, high-value European manufactured goods, wine, olive oil, glassware, weapons, tools, clothing, books, papers, and a number of passengers. The fleets then crossed the Atlantic with this eagerly anticipated bounty destined for merchants and settlers in the Americas. The New Spain Flota fleet sailed from Seville, usually in March-April, first to the Canary Islands and then across the Atlantic to arrive at San Juan on Puerto Rico. The fleet then hopped across to Santo Domingo on Hispaniola, on to Santiago de Cuba on the east coast of Cuba, and then arrived at Veracruz, Mexico. A different group, the Tierra Firme fleet, left Seville or Cadiz, typically in August-September, and sailed for Santa Marta and neighboring Cartagena, in today's Colombia, and then Portobelo, in modern Panama, before returning to Cartagena. The Manila Galleon. The Atlantic treasure fleets did not just carry the riches of the Americas, they also had in their holds precious goods from Asia. These latter were brought in another treasure fleet, the annual Manila Galleons that were loaded up in Manila in the Spanish Philippines and which then sailed to Acapulco. The voyage was a testing one and took on average 6 months. The Manila Galleons were in operation from 1565 to 1815. The Spanish themselves called them the Naos de China or Chinese ships as they carried high-value Eastern goods. Some of the items were sold in trade fairs in Acapulco, but much of it was transported to Veracruz where it was eventually loaded onto ships of the flota destined for Spain. Once unloaded, the galleons returned to Manila carrying, on average, 3 million silver pieces of 8 to buy new goods for the next trip to the Americas. From Havana to Spain. Havana was the heart of the Spanish Main and the point where all ships in the two treasure fleets assembled through the spring before crossing the Atlantic back to Europe. Havana had a narrow harbor, easily protected by its massive fortifications, and from the mid-18th century, a garrison of 6,000 men and 180 cannons protected this jewel of the Spanish Empire. The two fleets typically set off in summer but did not always sail together. When they did sail together, each fleet still had its own commander. The ships usually arrived in Spain in October or November. Protecting the fleet. A gigantic floating treasure chest was an obvious attraction for any rogue of the sea, but taking one was far from easy. Even in the pre-convoy early years, a Spanish galleon could present a formidable array of up to 60 cannons below and above deck, and they carried large crescent blades fixed to the yardarms, which were designed to cut the sails and rigging of any ship that dared get alongside. A galleon was certainly far bigger and far better armed than any pirate vessel and even most naval ships. Further, They had large crews and a contingent of professional soldiers led by a war captain. Passengers could put up a good fight, too. The elevated superstructures at the stern and bow of a galleon provided marksmen with an excellent platform above an enemy ship. The ships were also very difficult to find in the open sea. This was particularly so for the Manila Galleons, which sailed alone. Only 4 were ever captured in the relatively safer Pacific waters in over 250 years of service. Notable captures. In March 1579, Francis Drake captured the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, aka Cacafuego, a treasure ship which was taking 26 tons of silver bullion, 13 chests of plate, 80 pounds 36 kilograms of gold, and a great many gemstones from Peru to Panama. The value of the cargo was at least 1.5 million ducats, more than many European kingdoms' annual revenue, and it made Drake the richest man in England. The Manila Galleon Great Santa Ana was captured by Thomas Cavendish, 1560–1592, in 1587 and was carrying 22,000 gold pesos and 600 tons of precious silks and spices. Around 1620, at least according to our only source, the famed author on buccaneers Alexander Exquemelin, 1645–1700, the Norman pirate Pierre Le Grand, real name unknown, captured near Hispaniola no less a prize than the flagship of a Spanish treasure fleet. Le Grande's men had boarded the galleon during the night and taken the ship easily. In September 1628, a Dutch force of 31 ships led by Admiral Piet Pietersen Heijn, 1577–1629, captured the entire New Spain treasure fleet on its way to Havana. Heijn managed to seize 46 tons of silver and many other valuables. The capture was a sign of the times as Spain's naval power declined and that of Britain, France, and the Netherlands soared. These successes and others were the exceptions, though. Much more usual was for a few smaller and less valuable vessels to succumb to an attack when they had been separated from the main convoy, as happened in 1591 in the West Indies when a 5-ship fleet commanded by William Lane captured 2 isolated vessels of the New Spain fleet. The end of the treasure fleets. The quantities of loot extracted from the Americas declined from the 1620s, the mines in Peru producing less than a quarter of the silver by 1700 than they had been a century before. Conflicts like the War of the Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1714 severely disrupted the regularity of the treasure fleets. Nevertheless, the treasure ship convoys continued until the 1730s, with a small fleet continuing from Mexico alone between 1754 and 1789. Even if some single treasure ships continued to sail, by the mid-18th century, new trade centers had developed, and new commodities usurped the dominance previously held by silver, silk, and spices. The United States, Brazil, India, and China were the new big players, trading such lucrative goods as tea, opium, sugar, tobacco, coffee, and cotton in massive quantities worldwide.